What's up, everybody? Mr. Forrest back with another episode of Big Truths. Guys, how you been doing on your big truths? Have you been reviewing them? Let's review those at the end. But for now, let's jump right into the teaching. Steve Jenkins had a nickname, and that nickname was the Invisible Chicken Sandwich. And the Invisible Chicken Sandwich was a normal kid, like you. He was about your age. He liked to collect marbles, oxbloods, limeades, cat's eyes, oilies, turtles. He was learning to juggle. He could do 2 balls with one hand, and he was learning to do 3 balls with both hands. He was getting pretty good at it. He hated homework, but he loved recess. He loved riding his bike, and he loved riding his bike down to the pond. His dad had taught him to take the flat, smooth stones and skip them across the water. You know, where you get them just right spinning and they go tick, 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 tick across the water? He absolutely loved doing that. He had a pet tarantula named Cedric, and his favorite food in the whole world was a donut burger. Now, it wasn't really a burger. It was a concoction that he himself had created where you take 2 donuts and you put a chocolate chip cookie in between them and you eat it like this. So that's why he called it a donut burger. And instead of putting mayonnaise and ketchup on it like you would a regular burger, he would put extra whipped cream and sprinkle inside chocolate chips. It would make him hyper for a week. Now, his parents didn't let him eat donut burgers, but sometimes he would sneak them. Steve didn't really know the difference between good and evil in a real way. You see, at school his teachers would say things like, be good, behave, be nice, and Steve thought because he kept most of the rules at school that made him a good person. Steve didn't get into fights, and Steve didn't do what the other kids did, like they would sharpen their pencils super sharp, and then they would throw their pencils up and they would stick in the ceiling. So if you ever went into Steve's class, you'd see all these pencils stuck in the ceiling. Every time his teacher would turn her back, the kids would shoot spitwads at the big clock, so by the end of the day, you couldn't even see what time it is because it was so covered in spitwads. Steve thought those things were hysterical, but he didn't do them himself. When some of the boys kidnapped their class pet, it was a hamster named Cecil. They kidnapped him for an afternoon and dyed Cecil pink and then put him back in his cage. And the next day all the kids came to class and Cecil was bright pink and they all laughed, even Steve. But Steve didn't participate himself. A lot of the kids would take their gum and stick it under their desk when they were done with it or the bottom of their chair. Steve never did that. So because of all these things, Steve thought he was a good person. But one day in a church service, his pastor was preaching about sin. And his pastor said, everyone who ever lived since Adam is a sinner, even you. And it seemed like he pointed right to Steve, and Steve was like, me? And it shocked him. Steve said, what makes me such a bad sinner? I've never killed anyone. I don't hurt people. Some of the boys in my class smoke in the locker room. I don't smoke. People throw erasers out of the 4th floor window at kids that are out at recess. I don't do that. It's not like I wait till my teacher falls asleep in study hall and then take a picture of the inside of his nose and post it on Instagram. Except that one time. What makes me so bad? But his pastor, week after week, kept preaching about sin from the Bible. Now, last week, his pastor was talking about how Adam and Eve were created and everything was good, but then Adam and Eve sinned against God. And they brought sin into the world and suffering and pain and death as a consequence to sin. And this week, his pastor was preaching from Romans chapter 5. Let's take a look at one of the verses he read in verse 12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all because all sinned. Romans is teaching that because Adam was the first man, we're all connected to him. So when Adam sinned, in Adam we all sinned. When Adam brought death into the world, in Adam, we all die. Adam was the first one, so it was kind of like he was the representative of the human race, but in a very real sense, we are all connected to him. This led Steve to ask a very important question. Do people become sinners after the first time they sin? Or are people born sinners already? And that's an excellent question, and his pastor actually ended up answering it when he kept reading. Check it out. Verses 18 and 19. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Steve's head was spinning. You mean to tell me that I am held accountable for something someone else did who lived so long ago that I've never even met? You're telling me because Adam sinned that now I'm born a sinner? Because Adam sinned, now I have to face death? This isn't fair. It's not like I'm a bad person. It's not like I squirt chocolate milk through my straw all over Camilla Yeager and ruin her best dress. Except that one time. It's not like I take my sister's rubber ducky for a swim in the toilet lately. It's not like I blow my nose on my sister's socks. Well, at least not today. What makes me such a bad person? Why do I gotta pay for the things that Adam did? That day, Steve went home offended. But it was right there in front of him, in black and white, in God's Word, the Bible. Steve went home and he finished his lunch, and then he did his after-lunch ritual. It was his favorite thing to do after lunch. He would eat his Oreos. But he didn't eat his Oreos any normal way. He ate his Oreos the best way possible. He would take a sleeve of 6 Oreos and a wide-mouthed glass of cold milk. He would open the sleeve of Oreos and he would drop the first 2 Oreos, completely intact, completely whole, into the milk. Watch them completely sogify and then sink to the bottom like 2 delicious submarines. Then he would take the 3rd Oreo and he would hold it in the milk for exactly 12.4 seconds. Now, 12.4 seconds is the optimal time to keep an Oreo in milk for 2 reasons. Number 1, any less than 12.4 seconds and the Oreo would be too crunchy, and Steve did not like crunchy Oreos. Any more than 12.4 seconds, and when Steve would lift the cookie to his mouth, it would be too soggy and it would break off and plop in the milk, and then a drop of milk would splash up on his nose, and he hated having milk on his nose. So 12.4 seconds was perfect. And that's how Steve ate his Oreos. He would have none of this untwist it and lick out the filling and then put it back together. None of that nonsense. He would hold it in for 12.4 seconds and then take a bite. Now the remaining Oreo would look like a moon, or kind of like the letter C, and he would hold it by the tip and he would turn it that way and drop it in for exactly 12.4 seconds, then he would take a bite. Now the remaining piece that was in between his fingers, he would let go and let that part sink to the bottom to join the other soggy Oreos. He would do that with the rest of his Oreos, then he would drink the milk all the way down, and then stuck to the bottom of the cup would be this big sludgy, fudgy goop of melted, soggy Oreos. So he would hit the bottom of his cup 4 times, which would cause his face to welcome an avalanche of soggy Oreos and happiness. Steve was thinking fondly of his favorite ritual, and he realized he had an Oreo in milk and he wasn't clocking the time. He panicked, and he had it in there for 14.1 seconds, which is way too long to have an Oreo in milk, and he brought it to his face as quickly as possible, hoping to salvage the Oreo, but wouldn't you know it, it was too soggy, broke off, splash into the milk, and a drop of milk splashed up on his nose. Steve was furious. He was so angry that he said a bad word. He continued to eat his Oreos, and he was on Oreo number 5. He was relishing every moment of it when his sister walked in with Steve's roller skates. She was going to ask Steve if she could borrow his roller skates. But Steve hated being interrupted with his favorite ritual. And he got enraged, and he flew off the handle and said, "Can't you see I'm busy? I am King Oreo, and this is my palace. Ha 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 ha! Leave me alone." And his sister left, frightened and a little hurt. Steve finished his Oreo ceremony and he went upstairs to work on his book report. Now, his teacher had given them 3 weeks to read the book and write the book report, and it was due tomorrow. But Steve hadn't even started reading the book, let alone writing the book report. So Steve went upstairs, and one of the boys in his class was passing around Cliff Notes. Now, Cliff Notes are basically a summary of a book, so you can understand what the book was about without actually reading the book. For example, the book that Steve was assigned was 100 pages long, but the Cliff Notes were only 5 pages long. But instead of reading the book, Steve read the Cliff Notes. Instead of reading 100 pages, Steve just read 5 pages, and he wrote out a quick book report in no time flat. He had plenty of time to play and decided he wanted to go to the pond for the rest of the afternoon. But his parents didn't like him going to the pond by himself, so he lied. And he told them he was going to Billy Bridges' house. He packed up his backpack with his sketch pad and his pencils and his pens. He packed up his pet tarantula Cedric and his cage and put that in the backpack. And he also packed his favorite trail mix, which was made of marshmallows, Fruit Loops, and Grape Nerds. He slung his backpack over his back, got on his bike, and he rode down to the pond. And the pond was as peaceful and quiet as it has ever been. He skipped rock after rock, watching to see how many skips he could get across the water. He was having an absolute blast in the quiet, and he started to think as he was skipping rocks. He started to think about what his pastor said. And he thought once again, what makes me so terrible? Just because Adam was a sinner doesn't mean I'm a sinner. I'm not a bad person. In fact, if I was in the garden, I wouldn't have sinned like Adam did. His arm was getting tired from skipping rocks, and so he grabbed his backpack and he climbed up his favorite apple tree. And he hung his backpack on one of the branches, and he sat on a thick branch, and he reached out and grabbed a plump, delicious-looking apple, and he bit into it, and the juices ran down his chin and onto his shirt. Life didn't get much better than this. And with one hand he held his apple, and with his other hand he unzipped his backpack, and he got out his sketch pad and his pencils, and he looked at the beautiful trees, and he sketched the trees and the sun peeking through the trees. He finished his sketch, took another bite of his apple, and he was about to put his stuff away and go home, but then he saw his Bible inside his backpack. And he thought, why not read that Romans 5 thing again? He opened his Bible and he read in Romans 5. And once again, he started thinking about what his pastor said. So he thought about Romans 5 and he summarized it this way. Okay, Adam was the first person. When Adam sinned, he brought death into the world. Since Adam was the first man, he represented all humans. And because he was the first man, we're all connected to him. And when Adam sinned, in a sense, we sinned in Adam. We are participants in the first sin. And so everyone who's ever lived since Adam is a sinner. Even me? Steve thought, I don't know about that. Then he looked at the bookmark that was in his Bible. Now, his mom had given him a bookmark with several Bible verses written on the bookmark, and he decided to look them up. And the first one he saw was Psalm 58:3. It says this: "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies." And then something hit him like a ton of bricks. Wait a second. You don't have to teach a kid how to steal. You have to teach them not to steal. They already know how to steal. He thought about the first time he ever remembered stealing something. He was 3 years old, and he stole a pack of peppermint Trident gum from a Wawa convenience store. He thought to himself, you don't have to teach a kid to lie. They already know how to lie. And then he realized that he had lied and told his parents that he was at Billy Bridges' house when he was really at the pond. He thought to himself, you don't have to teach a kid to cheat. They already know how to cheat. And then he thought about his book report and how he didn't really read the book like he was supposed to. He read the Cliff Notes instead. He thought to himself, you don't have to teach a kid to be selfish. We already know how to be selfish. And then he thought about his roller skates and how his sister wanted to borrow his roller skates, but he didn't want her to borrow them because he was being selfish. He thought, you don't have to teach a kid to lash out in anger. A kid already knows how to lash out in anger. And then he thought about how his Oreo plopped into the milk and he got a drop of milk on his nose and how he said a bad word in anger. And then he thought about how his sister interrupted his favorite ceremony, and when she came in, he yelled at her in anger. Suddenly, Steve started thinking about it, and for the first time realizing he wasn't such a good person after all. He really was a sinner. He looked down at the bookmark and he looked up the rest of the verses. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 3:10, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. Psalm 14:3, they have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. 1 Kings 8:46, for there is no one who does not sin. 1 John 1:8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Steve suddenly realized he was a liar, and he was lying to himself. He was saying, I'm a good person, I'm not a sinner, but the truth is, he wasn't a good person, and he was a sinner, and he had been lying to himself. Suddenly he had a deep awareness of his sin, and he looked down at the apple that he had almost finished, and he almost dropped the apple because he realized something. This tree that I'm sitting on, it didn't magically become an apple tree the first time it bore an apple, like it was some other kind of tree, and then one day an apple went boop and appeared, and now magically it was an apple tree. No, from the time it sprouted as a seed, it had been an apple tree all along, and the reason it brought forth apples was because it was already an apple tree. And the reason Steve sinned was because Steve was already a sinner. He was born a sinner. But not only was he born a sinner, every day Steve chose to sin. So even when Steve said, if I was in the garden, I wouldn't have sinned, he was sinning at that moment, because thinking you're better than someone else is called pride, and it is a sin. And the truth is, if Steve was in the garden, Steve would have done the exact same thing Adam did. And the truth is, if you or if I was in the garden, we would have done the exact same thing Adam did. Nobody has excuses. No one is without sin. We are all sinners. And when Steve looked around, it's almost as if he saw the word everywhere. Guilty, 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 guilty. And then a gust of wind caught one page of his Bible and flipped the page over. Steve looked down, and what he saw caused him to gasp. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Big Truths. Listen, next week we're going to talk about the consequences of sin. And it's going to be pretty serious. But you're going to find out what happens to Steve next week, so you don't want to miss it. Guys, listen very carefully. Next week is the last episode of Big Truths until September. So you don't want to miss it. Also, I'm going to have lots of epic Bible fun videos starting now and going into the summer. I'm going to do lots of summer videos like at camp. I hope to see some of you guys at camp. So stay connected with the channel. We've got lots of good stuff for you. But before I leave you guys, I want to leave you guys with your memory verse for this week. Romans 5:19. For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. And let's go through our big truths together. All right? What is the Bible? God revealing himself and his plan to his people. How did we get the Bible? God guided human authors. Who is God? God is the wonderful, eternal being who exists apart from anything else. How does God exist? God exists in, say it with me, 3 persons. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one. How did the universe come to exist? God created everything out of nothing in 6 days. Who is the rightful ruler over everything? God, because he made everything, so he owns everything. What is sin? Sin is anything we do, say, or think that breaks God's law. And finally, who is a sinner? Everyone who ever lived since Adam, even me. Love you guys. Can't wait to see you next week. Until then, Mr. Forrest, out.